I love the Rashi.
Mm,
A
yeah.
quick brew.
Mm. Good morning, everyone. We are on September 24th, 2024. We are 21 Elul. Rosh Hashanah approaches. This morning, we're going to tackle the topic of when leaders grow old with a hat tip to Rabbi Yitzchak Grossman from the Beis Havad Halacha Center, who presented some of these sources in this approach. I think it's important to start off that age is just a number. So however old you are, you're only as old as you want to be for the purposes of this discussion. But it does jump off of what we experienced this past summer, which was the fact that we saw age play a factor in the discussion around President Biden's candidacy and subsequent exit from the 2024 presidential campaign. And so we're going to look at a headline when that was under discussion back in late June. He subsequently pulled out. What do Jewish sources say about age and about growing old, or is there a comparison in terms of Jewish appointments in leadership positions when it comes to being old? We're reading the final portions of the Torah, which has of Moshe Rabbeinu very famously saying that he's no longer able to go and come and go. Lo yachol latzeis v'lavo. He was 120 though, so maybe that's the age of mandatory retirement. So let's just take a look. Source number one. This is an article from the Associated Press. President Joe Biden worked forcefully Friday to quell Democratic anxieties over his unsteady showing in his debate with former President Donald Trump, as elected members of his party closed ranks around him in an effort to shut down talk of replacing him atop the ticket. Biden's halting delivery and meandering comments, particularly early in the debate, fueled concerns from even members of his own party that at age 81, he is not up for the task of leading the country for another 4 years. It created a crisis moment for Biden's campaign and his presidency, as members of his party flirted with potential replacements, and donors and supporters couldn't contain their concern about his showing against Trump. Even before the debate, Biden's age had been a liability with voters, and Thursday night's face-off appeared to reinforce the public's deep-seated concerns before perhaps the largest audience he will garner in the 4 months until Election Day. So that was the concern. His age, his debate performance was a result of his age. We all know what happened. We all know where we find ourselves. We know that there were polls that while Biden was still in the presidential race, overwhelming majority of Americans thought he was too old, and majority of Americans thought that Donald Trump is too old to be president. If you ask young people, anyone over 50 is probably too old to be president. So it's not really... polls these days, I'm not sure whether they're the best indicators, but we do know that there was a whole discussion about age and is it about ability? I don't know. This past week, I guess it was the New York Times book review. There was a review of a biography of Ronald Reagan. Right, everyone thought he was so old, and he was only like 78 or 76 when he left the White House, and that was considered too old. And now Donald Trump is beyond that age already. Right, and I think that when it comes to old, like I said earlier on, there's a certain subjectivity in what's considered old. You're as old as you feel. Certain ages might be considered objectively old. And when can you join the AARP? I think you only have to be 50. In which case I'm getting close to being old. Or there's 65 for Social Security, and the like, but. Is there a Jewish discussion beyond Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses turning 120 and thinking that he's realizing at that point that he's too old? We all know that the early figures in the Torah lived 930 years. Methuselah lived 969. Things got shorter. Abraham 175. Joseph 110. King David was 70. The idea also when you talk about the the length of our days is 70 years, and if we're strong, they're 80 years, right? Does that mean when you're getting close to 70, it's the end of a life? Our reaction sometimes to when people pass away, oh, that person is so fill in the blank, depending on the age, depending on their condition, and so forth. But what about Jewish sources when it comes to this topic in particular? Is it too old? Do you reach a point where you're too old to be a leader? So the Gemara Sanhedrin talks about the qualifications for being a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. Also relating could be to be a judge on any capital, any Beit Din that handles capital offenses as well. Here it talks about the Sanhedrin. We do not seat as a judge in a Sanhedrin in capital cases a zakein. I left the Hebrew. We translate it as old man. A man who is unable to sire children, or one who does not have children. Rabbi Yehuda says also a cruel person. So let's unpack this Mishnah. Right? You don't want someone who's old. You don't want someone who can't have children. You don't want someone who does not have children. And then you have this idea of a cruel person. So there seem to be a couple of different characteristics that are part of the qualifications of a judge. Before we get to the zakein, there seems to be a critical requirement that someone who's going to judge a capital case have children, or at least be able to have children. And also someone who can't be considered cruel. We have to kind of understand what that means, and we'll see that in a minute. But the idea of having children generally is understood that before we allow you to take someone's life, you have to imagine if that would be your own child. Someone who has children has a little bit more compassion and appreciation for life, or what it's like to lose a child, or it's not their child, but imagine it was your child. Would you still be willing to commit this person to guilt and to execution? You have to be really darn sure that this is actually the case, especially because you could appreciate the pain that a parent would suffer losing their child, even if the person was guilty. This can connect a little bit to the cruel person as well. So there's a certain amount of being able to have compassion, and maybe compassion is quantifiable. Having children, or the ability to have children, is quantifiable. And then it talks about zakein, just being old. The Tosefta on Sanhedrin, which is the analogous text for this Mishnah, just in terms of different texts. We talk about the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the collection of oral teachings and laws that was compiled during the rabbinic period, and in the year 200 was edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And then you have that corpus is the Mishnah. As you can imagine, if you're editing, you're leaving things on the cutting room floor. So some of the things being left on the cutting room floor were the Tosefta, the extra parts, from the word Tosef, Mosif, Lahosif, to have extra. Also, some left on the cutting room floor were what's called the Breita. The Breita are some of the teachings of the rabbis of the Mishnah that go a little bit beyond the Mishnah and weren't deemed necessary for the Mishnah. So the Tosefta very often looks like the Mishnah, and sometimes a different version of the Mishnah that was not included in the Mishnah. So just a piece of rabbinic literacy, literary history. So what does Tosefta say on this discussion? One who is unable to sire children, anyone who has not had children, are eligible to judge monetary cases, but not capital cases. It comes from the other direction. So same idea, no children, can't sire children, can't be a judge in a capital case. Rabbi Yehuda, as also a cruel person and a compassionate person, are ineligible to judge capital cases. Here, Rabbi Yehuda is not just talking about cruelty. Someone who's maybe too lenient is also excluded. You need someone who's even-keeled, not too gruff and angry, and not too sweet. You need someone who's just right. But which characteristic is not found in the Tosefta that was included in the Mishnah? Tosefta says nothing about zakein. Says nothing about an elderly disqualification. So what is the understanding of why zakein or not having children? How is that understood as the rationale? So Rashi kind of puts it all together in source number 4. For he has already forgotten the pain of raising children, he's not compassionate. right? You lose your compassion. You're more compassionate for your children, but you don't have raising them anymore. You're not going to be as compassionate. Now, some may argue, maybe some of the grandparents on this class would say, wait a second, you develop another level of compassion because you have the grandchildren. All right, Rashi just says at a certain level of stage in life, when you're no longer raising children, which means you're going to be more mature, you're going to be older chronologically, maybe your compassion is not the same as it once was. Brings to mind the expression, quote, in the name of different people, right? That they say that if you are 20 years old and a conservative politically, then you have no heart. And if you're 40 years old and you're more liberal, you have no brain. Right? So there's a certain tenderness that the young feel with the more idealistic worldview that then hardens over age. Maybe it's an extension of that expression. Rabbi Meir Abulafia, the Yad Ramah, another commentary of the Rishonim, the medieval authorities on the Sanhedrin, source number 5. And we are accustomed to explain that a zaken is intolerant, dato kitsara, and not compassionate. Right? So there's a certain level of impatience that develops as the older one gets. When I saw this Yad Ramah, I immediately thought back to the Muppets. Anyone remember the Muppet Show? Right, you had those two guys in the whatever the balcony seats there. I forgot the names. The grumpy old men. That's the Yad Ramah is the influence, the intellectual influence for those types of characters. So we see that there's certainly some sense that the older you get, you may be prone to lose certain characteristics that are essential for judging capital cases. It could be less compassion. It could be intolerance. It could be impatience. But we also don't. There's no real definition or discussion of a chronological disqualification. So much so that the Tosefta isn't really worried about the age. And that all gets reflected when the Rambam quotes this Mishnah and this discussion as Jewish law. Rambam Sanhedrin 2:3, source number 6. We do not appoint to any Sanhedrin a man of very old age. Zaken muflag bashanim. That's just the Hebrew. So just to show that the Rambam calls someone who's of very old age, or one who's unable to sire children, for they have cruelty, and nor one that doesn't have children, in order that he be merciful. So the Rambam brings it all together in terms of the rationale, in terms of looking for the right level of compassion, but also old age is a disqualification. But for the Rambam, it's very old age. And the Rambam doesn't want to quantify it as someone who's maybe a senior judge, someone with maturity, someone who's maybe even past the age of raising children, because he's thinking that there's there's a lot of flexibility. Muflag bashanim. When you say zaken muflag bashanim, the translation here is very old age, but the idea of muflag from the word spread out, maybe if a person is characterized or is defined by their old age, is another way of understanding it. If you encounter someone who you're introduced to who comes off as, man, that person is old, that I think is where the Rambam is going. It's kind of, it could be chronological, it could be the way the person presents themselves in terms of their ability to interact. But if the reaction you have with someone is, that's an old person, okay, then that person shouldn't be a judge. We'll see. Is it emotional? Is it cognitive? There are different ways of understanding it. But there is that concern of a person. That person's look. And then there are people who are over 100 who are very young and who seem like they can certainly run rings around younger people. But for the Rambam, if a person presents himself, the initial reaction, man, that person's really old. By the way they behave, that can be complicated. Just in terms of this idea of having children, the way that the idea of having children being compassionate. There's such a thing as strict parenting also, but the idea of having children being combined to compassion is something that gets discussed. The Talmud in Masechet Ta'anit talks about when the community is is pain. Like if there's a famine, then you're not supposed to have build families during famine. You're not supposed to engage in marital relations and have children. This is discussed. It might be familiar those who remember the Joseph story. And Joseph had children. It says there very specifically they had children before the famine, because during the famine you don't build a family and you don't want to create more mouths to feed when there's no food in the first place. And this leads to the whole discussion: what are the conditions when building families is the wrong thing to do from a halachic perspective? Because in a sense, this is not a time where we're going to be able to show compassion. Look, we read, we just read in the Tochacha that, the pain of having children in difficult times and people, mothers eating their children and having no food to offer their children. And there's a certain imagery that exists in the Torah, in the Bible, in the book of Eicha, in rabbinic literature, that to have children is from the realm of chesed, the realm of rachamim, kindness and mercy. That's when you have children. But when you don't have that capacity, then you don't want to have children. And there was an interesting article I read with regard to that. There is halachic literature during World War I and World War II of rabbis saying that parents should not have children. That families, if that meant, men and women should abstain from marital relations to avoid them, then that was the proper course of action, because we're in a period of great din and pain for people. You're not bringing children into this type of a world, and that's the type of mentality when there's it's much more limited and restrained and constricted, and it's the opposite of having optimism and compassion and the like. And even when you're judging someone who's on trial for a capital offense, you have to be able to look at both sides. And so that it comes to mind that having children shows that one has hope in the world. And it could go both ways. You have to be able to consider all possibilities. This person's guilty, this person's innocent. We don't want a person's life to be lost unless we're absolutely sure we're capable of convicting and executing. And in a parallel way, in difficult times, there's this idea that it's when there's no compassion in the world, don't have children. And this was not a very widely popular or accepted view, and there's some reactions against it. In particular, the one rabbi reports getting a good laugh out of reading how a certain rabbi said no children during times of war. But it does highlight that war, that children in compassion and chesed are in one lane, and without children, you have a certain situation where it's a very harsh kind of a world. That's the type of attitude and mentality we're trying to avoid. So Rambam puts it all together. You need to have compassion. You can't be too old. So how do we understand this idea a little bit about being too old? And why is the Rambam going? Why does the Rambam say Zaken? If the Rambam's not going to give us necessarily qualifications here or quantify it, why not just say no old people? So the commentary, the Lechem Mishnah commentary on the Rambam right here, source number 7, points out that the Talmud elsewhere, in fact, the Gemara on that Mishnah mentions that there's a teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, shehizkir b'samuch shetzarich lishtader achar baalei seva. Rabbi Yochanan says you want old people. So you don't want old people, you do want old people. So the Rambam kind of says you just don't want people a zaken muflag bashanim. And I think that also supports what we said before, this idea of if a person's age is the first thing you notice about them in terms of the way they present or the way they behave, that's the type of old person you don't want. Nothing wrong with a wizened old person, as long as they are able to, meet the other qualifications of being able to judge appropriately. And we can, we see that it's more about the capacity or acuity from the Rambam in the Laws of Witnesses and Testimony, source number 8, where the Rambam says that a shoteh, right? We usually translate a shoteh as a fool. It's referring to someone of diminished mental capacity, and some of the examples are given, is invalid as a witness min haTorah because he's not obligated in the mitzvot. Someone who is significantly mentally impaired is not someone who's obligated in the commandments, and it's not someone who can help the community fulfill its commandments. Not only a shoteh, and what's the example of someone who might be of this type of diminished capacity, someone who walks around naked, breaking things and throwing stones. All right, if that's the case, if that's what a person is known for, that's not necessarily a person who's of sound mind and can be entrusted with obligations, communal obligations, or testimony. Certainly, by extension, can't be a judge. But not only this level, it's not just the kind of obvious cases, but anyone whose mind is disturbed and continuously confused regarding a certain matter, even if he can speak and ask appropriately in other matters, he is invalid as a witness and is reckoned among the shotim. So the Rambam continues by pointing out that it's even a certain amount of significant confusion, even if he can, hold a conversation, but is not able to be able to maintain a coherent conversation about the topic at hand that's important, like, for example, for the cases of witnesses and testimony, what they saw. Certainly of a judge to be able to deliberate, right, then that person is viewed as of diminished enough capacity. Again, not specifically an age thing, but if someone reaches an age where this is how they present, that could be something that could guide us. And I think that we, so often, we can encounter this in our own, experiences. There are some people who start having a certain amount of cognitive decline, and they can go back and forth with how are you, nice to see you, and the like. But if you move away from some of the more direct interaction to talk about things that have more detail or require more thought or more discriminating opinions between something, becomes a little more complicated. And I think that's, so in my experience, what the Rambam is describing as when a person loses the ability to testify or judge from a cognitive perspective, certainly can be found people, those who are impaired for sure, certainly with regard to cognitive decline, and among those whose cognitive decline is coming with advanced age. Let's just stop for a minute, take some questions, because with this idea of we're going to explore some of the idea of older and wiser from a textual perspective and just a cultural perspective in a minute. Any reactions? Thoughts, questions, disagreements?
Rabbi?
Yes. Wow, it's the oldest person in the class the oldest person in the class has a comment. Great.
I was just going to reveal the secret. Anyway, I'm still able to drive carefully, and I haven't, thank God, had an accident, thank God, in a long time. But many people say you should stop driving at 90 or 85 or whatever. And I know that we're going to Pennsylvania for Rosh Hashanah, and my wife and my daughter and my son-in-law will not let me drive.
Wait, meaning, are you older than 65? How old are you?
95. I mean, 95, okay. January 28th.
I just wanted you to say your age.
In some respects, I'm not totally disabled. Why do they have these arbitrary rules?
Well, so I think that in a sense, they're trying to avoid arbitrary. They're trying to quantify something that's hard to quantify. So, the fact that we can argue about this, it could be that, just because you can't drive doesn't mean you can't judge or provide testimony from a halachic or Jewish law perspective. And in many ways, it's trying to be able to identify when there is that cognitive decline that impacts. And so I think the Rambam, is pointing out that if you're not able to have the ability for deeper reasoning or analysis, then that might be the time. It's not about a certain chronological age. It's not like those who, there's certain companies where the partners in law firms have to retire at a certain age. It's pointing out that it's really about the ability to reason and to discriminate for a case to judge one way or the other. The fact that you're arguing that we can argue about this, I think maybe, that doesn't sound like, Al, you've reached that age yet. So you can keep on judging, even if, maybe you shouldn't keep on driving.
Also, the concept of Zakenim has been early on in our Chumash. trying to, show the wiseness of people. And it's been a word that's been a household word. It's in the Pirkei Avot. You see it on the train. We're in Haifa. But things are different now where, whether COVID
Right.
has hastened the process or whatever.
Look, a lot of things, the idea, look, there's certainly, and we're going to see in the verses down there about honoring those who are Zakein. But, I think, one of the things I think you're referring to is they say that in the Jewish tradition, Zakein stands for Zeh Shekana Chachma.
Right. And
right? Someone who has acquired wisdom. So there's certainly respect for elders. There's respect for parents. There's an appreciation component. Here we're trying to get to when do you get too old from a Jewish perspective to be involved in certain things? The Rambam is saying, look, you're never too old, but at a certain point, your ability to discern is impaired in that your trustworthiness as a witness becomes no longer tenable, or your ability to serve as a judge in a capital case becomes no longer tenable. And I think that that very much connects with, how Jews view, getting, older and wiser. So, for example, the source number 9, it's a Mishnah on the end of Kinim. Kinim is relating to the sacrifices of birds, but there's some, kind of interesting material at the end of the Mishnah there. Rabbi Shimon ben Akashia says, elderly, unlearned men, as long as they continue to age, their minds get more confused. As it is stated, he removes the speech of the capable and takes away the reasoning of the elderly. But elders of the Torah are not like that. Rather, as long as they continue to age, their minds become even more settled. Datan miyushevet alehem. As it is stated, in the aged is wisdom, and in length of days, understanding. So here there's the idea, Torah scholars, get better with age. If you're not a Torah scholar, then your cognitive ability will decline, because Torah is what allows the people to remain focused and allow them to continue to remain, more aware mentally, cognitively, even as getting older, right? They talk a little bit about, these people, in general, keeping one's mind active with, different activities or word games or math games and the like. So there's something, probably, similar from that. Also, what could be, though, is a little bit of a pushback that the sages are saying, wait a second, we're getting older, we're getting wiser. We're not too old to judge. We're not too old to lead. We're not as spry as we used to be. But yeah, if we were ordinary people wasting away our lives with frivolous activities, then the older you get, maybe it's time to be pushed aside. But not the sages and the rabbis. I just thought to contrast that with a quote from, Biden said he dropped out, had nothing to do, right? He blamed his poor debate performance on being sick at the time. He brushed off concerns about his age and mental acuity, leaving aside the objective truth of where his, how he would perform on different tests, or what you think of his cognitive ability, or whatever videos you saw about how bad things were. On the one hand, it's not only about, it's not just about a debate performance. There could be a reason behind it. The rabbis feel older and wiser applies to Torah scholars and sages. More elderly presidents think the same thing. Don't box me out because of bad performance and immediately think it's a cognitive decline as opposed to getting a little bit older. Yes, Howard.
Yeah, I'm looking at a posuk in Chayei Sarah, the Avraham Zakein Bo Bayomim.
Right.
Hashem Beirachas Avram Bakol, and the commentary seems to say he's described as old Zakein with its connotation of wisdom and maturity. So it's almost the exact what you just said in the last few sentences, that getting old could be like a positive for brain power.
Yeah,
right. The Baba Yamim is what complicates that, because Baba Yamim can also be kind of, you're arriving at the end of your days.
Right.
So, there's, again, you're as old as you feel. But what indications do we have from a Jewish perspective? So when it comes to judging and witnessing and the like, there's concern of cognitive decline. It doesn't tell us what, it gives us some definitions of when that might be, in terms of when a person when a person might reach that age, or what are the signs that a person is at that point. What the Mishnah and Kinim I'm presenting as pointing out is that the rabbis really felt, no, we can keep going as long as, I don't want to say we want, but we can certainly keep going, because from a Torah perspective or a Torah wisdom perspective, older is wiser, right? Sometimes it takes rabbis to get to their 70s or 80s before they get recognized as being authoritative, because it comes from that. That's, thankfully, there's a more commonly there's an older because there's no longer lifespan these days, for more commonly held. The average lifespan is, getting closer to 80, some places above 80. Right? Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the major influence in Ashkenazi halacha, died at the age of 42 or 43. So I think that the sources that we have, give us some indication that older is wiser. There's some indication that there's some indication that the sages felt they could keep going and going, and that maybe that's just a function of when you're in that position, you don't want to be cast aside. So when it comes to what this means, older and wiser, from this Mishnah Kina, Rabbeinu Nissim Gerona talked about this. The intention of the Mishnah, source number 11, is not to say that the wisdom of elders of Torah increases as they age. Can't say you don't get wiser as you get older. For it's possible this is not so. The intellect requires physical vessels. It's possible that when a person becomes extremely old and the vessels become extremely weak, the intellect will weaken as well. Right? It's possible that older doesn't make you wiser. At some point, older is more complicated. You notice here too, just like the Rambam, he doesn't want to say when you get old. He says when you get extremely old, right? And I think that the definition of old gets chronologically older the older you get, and maybe that's there too. But Rabbeinu Nissim is pointing out the rabbi saying that they get better with age. Experience helps, but it could be that from a physical perspective, it's not so simple, and you have to beware of that decline. Similarly, the Or HaChaim on Bereshit, we see that when a man ages, his understanding is diminished. Even a scholar cannot go out and come, invoking the language of Moshe in the battle of Torah, and his senses are diminished. Although the sages of blessed memory have said that the minds of elders have become increasingly settled as they age, right? Like what we saw in the Mishnah, they were careful to say settled, as opposed to the ignorant elders whose minds become increasingly confused. Nevertheless, the power of the intellect and understanding is nullified. They become calmer. Doesn't mean they're able to remember more or the like. So the Or HaChaim is also, like Rabbeinu Nissim, presenting a bit of a reminder that yes, older and wiser, and we don't want to limit our elders from leading as they get older, but be careful. Right? It's not a promise that the person gets older, so they should be given more responsibility. Right? I think that everyone is still referencing back to some of the limits that the Rambam placed on the witnesses to recognize if a person reaches a certain point where the cognitive decline precludes them from engaging in the sharp debate or remembering the details or being able to discern the facts and such, we have to be a little bit careful. So older can be wiser, or we're not limiting chronologically the ability of the sages and the rabbis to lead, but it's not automatic. Now, just some thoughts on how the rabbis look at age, and people mentioned this Mishnah in Pirkei Avot before that talks about different stages in life, and just in terms of when you get old, right? So it talks about being 20, you're chasing a livelihood. Ben shloshim lakoach, strength, the peak strength. Ben arba'im labina, 40, you have wisdom. Chamishim la'etza, 50, you can give counsel. Ben shishim lazikna, 60 is old age. Sorry, everybody. No, but so zakein is that shivim laseva, fullness of years. Invoking King David, 70-year lifespan. Shmonim legvura, 80 is an age of strength because you were able to live 10 extra years. Tishim lasuach, 90 is a bent body. Ben me'ak ilu meis v'avar ubatel min ha'olam. If you live to be 100, you're as good as dead. Now that's a little bit negative. I think it comes from the fact they didn't have as many people living to that age before. So it's So it's but again, if we go back to what mentioned, that Rosie mentioned before, that that zikna is about acquiring wisdom, right? You live 60 years, you've learned a lot in your life and had the life experience. Maybe that's the idea of getting old, as opposed to 70 and 80. But again, it's a process more than it is a definition that a zakein is someone who's chronologically old.
I saw it on a pillow. I saw it on a pillow. He who dies with the most toys wins.
Okay. It's a state of mind. I think we're going to see that in a minute. Just the Vayikra, where it talks about that you're supposed to rise for the aged. And the term that he used there is Sheva, which is 70. Again, it's not necessarily about a chronological age to admire or respect, but I did want to point out that it says the term for respecting or show deference is Vahadarta. The Hebrew Vahadarta has the similar shoresh root as Hadar, Hidur, which means beautified. The only other place that the word Hadar appears in the Torah is in the Etrog, the pre-Eitz Hadar, the beautiful fruit, which is the esrog. And so there's a sense that it's the idea of beauty and richness and fullness is what's being respected when it comes to those who are older in years. And a very famous story where Rabbi Aryeh Levine teaches the lesson that people spend a lot of time looking for a beautiful esrog. They should put as much effort into respecting those who are seva v'hadarta pnei zakein. So the idea that it's not necessarily something that's the idea of respecting age and respecting the life experience, the wisdom, or just the existence of someone who's lived years is something that we're supposed to revere. And last, one verse that we'll be saying a lot in the coming weeks, Al tashlicheni le'zikna kechlos kochi al ta'azveni. King David says, do not cast me off into an old age when my strength fails, do not forsake me. And how the idea that, it's kind of impossible to stop being up in years because, time stands still for no one. But maybe it's this idea of zikna to try and avoid the mindset or or you're only as old as you act. How can we maintain a more energetic or positive or youthful view of things, and to live a life that doesn't make us, old too soon, right? Something has the expression that the kid looks so serious, he looks like an old man, right? So we're trying to avoid that outlook in addition to all of the chronological and cognitive aspects as well. So on the one hand, Judaism does take the issue of leaders, scholars, judges growing old as an issue to address. It tries to look at the qualifications and the abilities more than the chronology. Even if chronology does appear in certain ways, we recognize that there's decline at times and should be sensitive towards that. In general, the religious life well lived is viewed as assisting people to be able to grow wiser, older and wiser, quote unquote, live better, longer lives when engaged in appropriate lifestyle, revere those who are up in age for their life experiences, and we hope and pray that we don't have to live old lives regardless of the age that we are in. And I know we all got a little bit older during the course of this discussion, but hopefully we're coming out feeling a little bit more youthful and energetic for the rest of the day, rest of the week, and to greet the Jewish New Year.